The vast, cold void of space shimmered as the Zaltharis fleet emerged from warp, their dark, angular warships blotting out the stars. Overlord Vector observed the blue-green planet below through the command deck's reinforced viewport. His elongated fingers drummed against the console, his crimson eyes narrowing in calculated amusement. Earth, primitive, unshielded, doomed. Vector exhaled slowly, surveying the intelligence reports flickering across the holographic display before him. The humans possessed no planetary defense grid, no interstellar fleet to challenge them. Their military relied on crude projectile weaponry, and their combat vehicles lacked energy shielding. A waste of effort, he thought. The battle was already won before the first shot was fired. Still, he had been trained never to disregard protocol, no matter how unnecessary it seemed. His second-in-command, strategist Raul Ka, stepped forward, his black exoskeletal armor gleaming under the artificial light. "The planet's leaders have received our transmission," Raul Ka reported. As expected, they refused to surrender. Vector allowed himself a quiet chuckle. Predictable. Let them believe they have a choice. Send the invasion orders. The cities fall by sundown. Raul Ka inclined his head and relayed the command. The warships shifted position, descending toward the planet's atmosphere like silent harbingers of annihilation. General Marcus Reed stood at the heart of Earth's most fortified military installation, his arms crossed as he studied the incoming fleet on the holomap. The room buzzed with tension. Officers moved with urgency, relaying reports, coordinating responses. None of it seemed to matter. No human force had ever faced an enemy like this. 78 warships in total, Commander Nathan Drake muttered. Beside him, scrolling through the latest scans. Orbital deployment capabilities, ground assault divisions. If these estimates are correct, we're outgunned 20-1. Reed barely reacted. The numbers were irrelevant. They could have been outgunned 1,000-1. It wouldn't change the reality of the fight. Captain Elias Monroe, standing nearby, folded his arms. "So, what's the plan, General? Because right now, I'm not seeing a path to victory." Reed exhaled through his nose. "There isn't one. Not by conventional standards." The room fell silent. "We've spent centuries fighting each other," he continued, voice low but firm. "Refining our weapons, our strategies. But what we do best, the thing that has kept us alive as a species, isn't brute strength. It's adaptability." Drake frowned. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we don't fight them the way they expect." Reed turned to Monroe. "Our best pilots. How many do we have?" Monroe hesitated. "If we pull everyone, maybe 400 across all squadrons. Not enough to take them head-on." "We won't be taking them head-on. We're going to make them bleed in ways they don't see coming." A murmur rippled through the gathered officers. Drake, ever the strategist, leaned in. "They're an empire, General. Empires operate on structure, discipline, predictability. If we deny them that, then we deny them victory," Reed finished. Monroe exhaled, shaking his head. "Gonna be one hell of a fight." "It always is," Reed muttered. "Now let's get to work." The Zaltharis landers broke through the upper atmosphere, their sleek black holes reflecting the midday sun as they descended toward Earth's surface. From the ground, civilians watched insolent terror. Some prayed, others fled. Some simply stood frozen, as if hoping the moment wasn't real. In a ruined sector of New York City, Sergeant Cole Briggs adjusted his rifle and signaled to his squad. The streets were eerily quiet, the once bustling metropolis now a battleground in waiting. The invasion had begun, but the first moves belonged to them. Briggs pressed a hand to his earpiece. "Status," a voice crackled through. "Squads are in position, ready to initiate Phase 1. He looked up, watching as the first of the alien crafts touched down. The Zaltharis warriors disembarked in perfect synchronization, their tall, armored forms moving with cold precision. They did not hesitate, did not check their surroundings, did not expect an ambush. Briggs smiled grimly. Light them up. A series of controlled explosions erupted across the street, shattering pavement and flipping alien transport vehicles. Gunfire followed, tearing into the unsuspecting troops before they had a chance to react. Smoke and chaos swallowed the sector, as human forces emerged from hiding, striking with calculated fury. The Zaltheris regrouped swiftly, their advanced weaponry responding with deadly efficiency. Bright blue plasma fire cut through debris, forcing Briggs and his team into cover. "They're adapting," one of his men growled. "So do we," Briggs snapped back, swapping magazines. He glanced down the street, where more enemy troops were advancing. "Tell command we need reinforcements." "They said we're on our own for now." Briggs exhaled sharply. "Then we do what humans do best. We improvise." Overlord Vector's lips curled in irritation as the first reports of resistance reached him. He had anticipated token defiance, a brief delay before humanity crumbled under the might of the Empire. But this was something different. He leaned over the control panel, watching live feeds of the battlefield. Cities had not fallen as expected. Instead of open surrender, the humans had vanished into their own infrastructure, turning urban environments into labyrinths of death. Zaltheris forces encountered relentless ambushes, precision strikes that crippled supply lines and command units. The humans were not simply resisting, they were counterattacking. Strategist Ralka's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried unease. The enemy's tactics are unconventional. They avoid direct engagements, striking from hiding, targeting our logistical centers. "They fight like scavengers," Vector muttered. "They fight to win." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Vector straightened. "Deploy additional reinforcements. Double the ground forces. If they wish to hide, we will burn them out of their holes." Ralka hesitated. "Overlord, our estimates suggested this conflict would be resolved within the day. If we are escalating—" Vector's gaze darkened. "Then our estimates were wrong." Ralka bowed his head and relayed the command. Vector turned back, toward the viewport, watching as explosions dotted the planet's surface. The humans were putting up more of a fight than expected, but in the end it would not matter. They were outmatched, outnumbered. The Empire would not tolerate defiance. Victory was inevitable, wasn't it? Smoke drifted through the ruined streets of Washington, D.C., curling around shattered buildings and overturned vehicles. The once proud capital had become a battlefield, its landmarks now obscured by debris and fire. The Zaltheris forces advanced through the wreckage in perfect formation, their heavy boots crunching over broken glass and rubble. Their plasma rifles hummed softly, ready to incinerate any resistance. But the city remained eerily silent. No civilians, no retreating. Soldiers, just the wind howling through the ruins. Overlord Vector watched the advance through the command ship's tactical displays, his irritation growing. Hours had passed since the invasion began, yet his forces were nowhere near securing control. Humanity's resistance was not only persistent, but unpredictable. They did not fight like the subjugated species of the past. They did not rally to defend a single stronghold, nor did they engage in battles of attrition. Instead, they attacked in swift, coordinated strikes, vanishing before the Zaltheris could mount a proper counteroffensive. In New York, squads had been ambushed the moment they disembarked. In Beijing, alien supply lines had been cut, leaving entire units stranded without reinforcements. And in orbit, human pilots had inflicted unacceptable losses on the fleet, their crude yet nimble aircraft darting through defensive fire with terrifying effectiveness. Vector clenched his jaw. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. Inside an abandoned subway tunnel beneath D.C., Sergeant Cole Briggs crouched in the shadows, listening as the distant sound of alien boots echoed through the underground passages. He tightened his grip on his rifle and signaled to his team, the movement barely perceptible in the dim light. The Zaltharis had finally sent ground forces below, but it wouldn't save them. The tunnels belonged to the Resistance now. A soldier beside him, Private O'Connor, whispered, "They don't know what they've walked into, do they?" Briggs allowed himself a small smirk. "Not yet." A distant explosion rumbled through the tunnel, and the aliens immediately tensed. Briggs raised a hand, counting the seconds in his head. Right on time. Above ground, in the war-torn streets, a column of Zaltharis armor moved cautiously through the ruins. They had learned to expect human trickery, but preparation was not the same as understanding. They had no concept of urban warfare. They did not anticipate that every shattered skyscraper was a sniper's nest, every abandoned building a potential trap. The first vehicle detonated in a fiery blast, shrapnel ripping through the air. The second veered sharply, trying to retreat. Only for a cluster of concealed missiles to streak from the rooftops, slamming into its hull. In the tunnels below, Briggs and his team listened to the chaos above, the panicked shouts in the alien tongue. He tapped his earpiece. Go. Silently, the Resistance fighters emerged from hidden alcoves, moving with lethal precision. The Zaltharis troops had expected an ambush, just not from below. Briggs fired first, a controlled burst to the nearest enemy's helmet, sending the soldier crumpling before he could react. The rest of the team followed suit, gunfire erupting in the confined space. The aliens fought back, but they were too slow. Their armor, built for large-scale planetary invasions, was cumbersome in close quarters. Their discipline, so effective in standard warfare, became a liability when their formations were disrupted. Minutes later, the tunnel fell silent once more. Briggs wiped sweat from his brow, stepping over the bodies of their would-be conquerors. O'Connor nudged one with his boot. "Not so invincible now, are they?" Briggs ignored him, pressing his earpiece. Phase 2, complete, awaiting orders. On the other end, a familiar voice responded. General Marcus Reed. "Good work. The real fight starts now." Across the planet, Resistance forces executed similar strikes, whittling down the invaders with a ruthless efficiency that no other species had ever dared. The Zaltharis had never encountered a foe who turned terrain into a weapon, who disrupted logistics with the precision of a surgeon cutting an artery. And in orbit, Captain Elias Monroe prepared to show them just how deadly humans could be in the skies. Monroe gripped the controls of his fighter, sweat beading on his forehead as he navigated through the wreckage of a destroyed Zaltharis cruiser. The enemy fleet remained formidable, but it was clear they had not expected to lose. So many ships. Their formations were tightening, their defensive measures growing desperate. It was time to push harder. "Control, this is Valkyrie Squadron," he said into his comm. "Engaging primary target." A chorus of acknowledgments filled his earpiece as his squadron accelerated. Their target was a Zaltharis dreadnought, a floating fortress armed with enough firepower to level a continent. Monroe knew they couldn't destroy it outright, not with their current weaponry, but they could cripple it. "Follow my lead," he ordered, shifting his fighter into a near-vertical climb using the planet's gravitational pull to slingshot himself into position. The dreadnought's defensive cannons opened fire, streams of plasma slicing through the void, but Monroe and his pilots wove through the barrage with practiced ease. Then they struck. A precisely coordinated barrage of missiles slammed into the dreadnought's exposed thrusters, sending it into a slow, spiraling descent. Damage reports flooded the Zaltharis channels. The mighty warship meant to dominate. From above was now a wounded beast falling toward Earth's atmosphere. In the command ship, Overlord Vector's fists tightened. He had underestimated these creatures. Their technology was inferior, their weapons unimpressive. But their minds, those damned unpredictable minds, were proving to be the real threat. Strategist Ralka hesitated before speaking. "Overlord, Our calculations were incorrect. Humanity's resistance is not collapsing. It is escalating. Vector turned sharply. Then we escalate as well. Prepare orbital bombardment protocols. Ralka flinched. Sir, that would destroy entire sectors, millions of their civilians. They do not fight with honor, Vector snarled. They fight like predators. We will remind them whose Gutiku, the true apex species, is. As his orders were relayed, fire rained down from the heavens. Entire city blocks were reduced to molten craters, the night sky illuminated by streaks of burning plasma. The Zaltheris had abandoned their plans of subjugation. Now it was about annihilation. And yet, even as the world burned, the humans did not break. Briggs pulled himself from the rubble of what had once been a fortified position, coughing through the dust. His team was scattered, some missing, others dead. He didn't have time to grieve. The war wasn't over. It was only getting started. Monroe's fighter twisted through the atmosphere, narrowly avoiding the debris of a falling ship. The dreadnought they had crippled was now a burning wreck, plummeting toward the ocean. The Zaltheris were losing control of their own battlefield. And in the command center, General Reed watched it all unfold, a grim smile tugging at his lips. They were bleeding the invaders dry. The longer the fight lasted, the more mistakes the Zaltheris made, and humans thrived on mistakes. Vector had come expecting submission. Instead, he had found a species that refused to be conquered. This was no longer an invasion. This was war. Flames licked the shattered remains of what had once been Chicago's financial district, turning the skyline into a jagged silhouette of destruction. The air stank of scorched metal and death. Overlord Vector surveyed the battlefield from his command ship, his expression unreadable. The war had dragged on far longer than it should have. By now, humanity should have been nothing more than a memory, their cities reduced to smoldering graves. And yet, they persisted. Worse, they adapted. Vector had seen it unfold firsthand. The initial human resistance had been an irritation, unexpected but manageable. Their guerrilla tactics were frustrating, their ambushes inconvenient. But over the past days, something had shifted. The humans were no longer just surviving. They were learning. They had deciphered the Zaltheris strategies, found weaknesses in their formations, exploited vulnerabilities in their technology. What should have been a swift and total domination had become a grueling, unpredictable war. His second-in-command, strategist Ral Ka, approached, his mandibles clicking in unease. Overlord, our forces have sustained significant losses in the Western territories. Their attacks are coordinated. They strike our supply lines, disrupt our logistics. We are losing efficiency. Efficiency. A polite way of saying they were losing soldiers, ships, and morale at an alarming rate. Vector turned slowly, his red eyes narrowing. And what do you propose? A beat of silence. We retreat. The word was a curse, a stain on their empire's reputation. Vector's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. We do not retreat. We escalate. Ralka hesitated. If we escalate further, there will be nothing left to conquer. Then let the ruins serve as a warning to any species foolish enough to resist us, Vector growled. Ralka lowered his head and obeyed. The bombardments intensified. The Zaltheris no longer sought to control humanity. They sought to erase them. But even as entire city blocks were incinerated from orbit, the humans did not break. In the war-torn outskirts of Houston, General Marcus Reed stood in a dimly lit bunker, surrounded by flickering monitors displaying the state of the battlefield. Each red marker represented an enemy stronghold, each blue marker a dwindling human force. He exhaled slowly. The situation was dire. Supplies were running low. Communication disruptions were rampant. Casualties were mounting. Yet there was something else buried beneath the grim reality of war, something the Zaltheris failed to understand. Reed turned to Commander Nathan Drake, who was hunched over a terminal, his sharp eyes scanning the latest intelligence reports. How much longer until they realize they're fighting the wrong kind of war? Drake's lips twitched into a smirk. I'd say they're already starting to figure it out. Across the battlefield, human resistance groups had stopped, merely attacking supply lines and foot soldiers. They had moved on to something much larger, sabotaging the very infrastructure that kept the Zaltharis invasion operational. In a devastated industrial sector of Berlin, Sergeant Cole Briggs and his team moved through the ruins of a Zaltharis energy station, their steps silent despite the crunch of debris beneath their boots. This was one of the invaders' primary power sources, feeding their planetary defense systems, their weapon batteries, and their command nodes. The aliens relied on their superior technology to maintain control. But what happened when that technology was turned against them? Briggs knelt beside the primary conduit and set down an explosive charge. O'Connor, his explosives expert, worked swiftly, hands moving with practiced efficiency. The rest of the team stood guard, their rifles trained on the exits. The plan was simple. Destroy the power grid, throw the Zaltharis into disarray, and strike while they scrambled to recover. Detonator set, O'Connor whispered. 10-second. Delay once I hit the trigger. Briggs nodded. Do it. A click. The team was already moving before the first explosion tore through the structure, sending a shockwave through the underground facility. The lights flickered, then died. Moments later, the entire city block plunged into darkness. The effect was immediate. Across Berlin, Zaltharis command nodes went offline. Defense systems failed. Automated patrols froze in place, their artificial intelligence severed from the network. Human forces, lying in wait, surged forward, striking before the enemy could regroup. And this wasn't the only attack. In Tokyo, a similar operation unfolded as human engineers infiltrated a Zaltharis relay station, flooding their encrypted channels with false orders, sending their own troops into ambushes. In Moscow, a resistance cell hijacked an alien transport, using it to infiltrate a supply depot before turning the stolen weapons against their former owners. One by one, the pillars of the invasion began to collapse. On board the Zaltharis command ship, alarms blared. Strategist Ralka's voice was tight with barely concealed panic. Overlord, our systems are failing. The enemy has compromised our infrastructure. Vector watched the battlefield, his anger simmering beneath the surface. The humans should have been reduced to scattered survivors, fighting a losing battle for their own survival. Instead, they were striking here, at the very heart of his war machine. This was no longer resistance, this was retaliation. In orbit, Captain Elias Monroe tightened his grip on the controls of his fighter, leading his squadron through the wreckage of another Zaltharis cruiser. The enemy fleet, once a near impenetrable wall of destruction, had been forced into a defensive formation. Monroe had been in enough dogfights to recognize what that meant. They're on the ropes, his wingman radioed. Monroe allowed himself a small smile. Then let's finish what we started. The squadron dove toward their next target, an enemy battlecruiser attempting to withdraw from the conflict. Humans had been underestimated from the beginning. Now, for the first time in the war, the Zaltharis were running. In the command bunker, General Reed straightened, eyes glinting with something dangerous. The war had not been won yet, but for the first time, victory no longer seemed impossible. He turned to Drake. What's our next move? Drake's fingers danced over the keyboard, pulling up a schematic of the Zaltharis command structure. A single point blinked at the center of the display, the heart of the invasion. Their war council is still operational, Drake murmured. Cut off the head, and the rest falls apart. Reed's expression hardened. Then we cut off the head. Briggs's team was already en route. The mission was simple. Infiltrate the Zaltharis primary command hub and dismantle their leadership. The facility, located in what had once been Paris, was heavily fortified, but that had never stopped humans before. The war had begun with an invasion, a calculated, merciless attempt to subjugate an entire species. But now the balance had shifted. Now the invaders were the ones being hunted. The night sky over Paris burned with the remnants of a war never meant to last this long. The once mighty Zaltharis fleet, now fractured and reeling, clung desperately to their strongholds. Their confidence had been eroded, their war doctrine shattered, and the humans, those fragile creatures they had so thoroughly dismissed, had become the architects of their downfall. Sergeant Cole Briggs moved like a shadow through the ruined streets, his rifle pressed tightly against his chest. His team was down to 4 men. The rest had fallen in the chaos of their last engagement, cut down by plasma fire or crushed beneath collapsing buildings. He had mourned them in silence, then moved on. There was no time for grief. Ahead, the Alien War Council's command hub loomed, a towering monolith of dark metal. It pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, the last vestiges of the Zaltharis technological dominance. Somewhere inside, Overlord Vector and his advisors were making their final desperate plans, clawing for a victory that was already slipping through their fingers. Briggs tapped his earpiece. "We're in position." General Marcus Reed's voice came through, steady despite the urgency beneath it. "Acknowledged. We're coordinating a final assault on all enemy strongholds. If you take that command center, the war ends tonight." Briggs exhaled slowly. No more hit-and-run tactics. No more bleeding the enemy dry. This was the kill shot. He turned to his men. "We go in fast, hit hard, and don't stop moving. No second chances, no prisoners. You see a target, you drop it." The nods he received were grim, resolute. They all understood. This was the moment everything had been leading toward. The first explosion ripped through the eastern wall of the command hub, sending shards of alien metal raining across the courtyard. Briggs was already moving before the dust settled, his boots pounding against the ground. The Zaltharis inside scrambled to respond, caught between the remnants of their once invincible pride and the stark reality of their crumbling empire. A soldier rounded the corner ahead, his armor catching the dim light. Briggs fired twice, center mass, and the alien collapsed without a sound. His team spread out, clearing the corridor with ruthless precision. They had fought these creatures long enough to know their weaknesses, the sluggish way they turned in close quarters, the delay in their energy weapons recharge, the way their rigid formations collapsed when disrupted. For all their technological superiority, the Zaltharis had never needed to be adaptable. And now, against an enemy that thrived on adaptation, they were dying in droves. In the heart of the command center, Overlord Vector gripped the edge of the war table, his elongated fingers curling into the surface. The reports flooding his console were impossible. His forces were being overrun. His fleet was in retreat. The humans had done more than resist. They had turned the full weight of the Empire against itself. Ralka stood beside him, his voice subdued. "Overlord, we must leave. If we fall here, there will be nothing left." Vector barely heard him. His mind reeled, replaying the events of the past days, searching for the moment everything had gone wrong. It had been when the humans refused to fight the way they were expected to, when they refused to break under superior firepower, when they turned every loss into a lesson, every battle into a stepping stone toward something greater. They had evolved in real time, shifting their tactics, breaking apart every advantage the Zaltharis had ever relied upon. Vector had come here expecting submission. He had found something else, something terrifying. "They are unnatural," he murmured. "No species should be capable of this." A deafening explosion rocked the chamber and the lights flickered. The humans were inside. Briggs pushed forward, adrenaline burning through him like fire. The final doorway stood before them, reinforced and locked. He set the last of their explosives, then stepped back. Clear. The detonation tore through the barriers, sending a shockwave through the hall. As the dust settled, Briggs stormed inside, weapon raised. Vector turned sharply, his crimson eyes locking on to the human soldier before him. For the first time, in his long, ruthless career, he felt something foreign coil in his chest. Fear. Briggs aimed, finger resting on the trigger. The Zaltharis overlord, once so mighty, stood frozen before him. There would be no speeches, no monologues, no mercy. He fired. The plasma round struck Vector cleanly in the chest, punching through his armor. The alien staggered backward, gasping in shock. He clutched at the wound as his knees buckled. Ralka stepped forward in horror, then stopped. Around him, human soldiers flooded into the chamber, weapons trained on the remaining council members. The war was over. Vector's vision blurred, darkness creeping at the edges. His empire, his legacy, his superiority, it had all been an illusion. The humans had shattered it, exposed it for the brittle thing it had always been. His lips parted, but no words came. He collapsed. Briggs exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. The room remained still for a long moment, as if even the air itself was absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Then his earpiece crackled. Status? Reed's voice. Briggs swallowed. Target eliminated. Command center secured. Silence. Then Reed spoke again, quieter this time. It's over. Outside, the remaining Zaltharis forces, leaderless and disoriented, faltered. Across the planet, human forces pushed forward, taking the last strongholds without resistance. The fleet, once an unbreakable armada, fractured completely, abandoning the battlefield in a desperate retreat. On the command ship orbiting above, the last of the War Council members fled, sending a final transmission across the stars. Do not return to Earth. Captain Elias Monroe watched from his cockpit as the alien ships vanished into the void. His hands trembled slightly, the weight of it settling in. They had won. On the ground, Reed stood before a broken city, his gaze unreadable as he listened to the scattered reports confirming the retreat. The world had changed forever. They had fought back against an empire spanning hundreds of worlds, and they had won. But this victory had come at a cost. The dead lined the streets, their sacrifices woven into the fabric of history. Humanity had proven its strength, but it had also learned the depths of its own brutality. Drake stepped beside him, looking out at the wreckage. They won't come back. Reed nodded slowly. No, they won't. Briggs sat on the steps of the ruined command hub, the adrenaline finally fading. He looked up at the sky where the last embers of battle still flickered. Somewhere out there, the Zaltharis still existed. But they would never forget this day, and neither would humanity. The war had begun with an invasion. It had ended with a warning. Earth was not to be conquered. It was to be feared.